our link to the website in case you are need to catch up on anything or would like updates or would like to review anything. All the videos are there and are posted there. So we've got about 20 videos now. So we've been doing this for quite a while, about half a year. So I appreciate everyone who's been sticking around the whole time. Thank you for your patience last week. Also, I'm sorry I was not feeling well. I had a pretty bad cold, so I was sick in bed. So I appreciate everyone coming back and joining us again this week. And so what we're discussing now, this is now 2 weeks ago, we started the 5th chapter of Kohelet. So the 5th chapter was really building off of the ideas mentioned in the 4th chapter, but he goes into a kind of a new discussion. We actually saw, again, 2 weeks ago, starting with the last verse of the 4th chapter. Again, I argue that really that last verse of the 4th chapter really belongs in the 5th chapter. Unfortunately, we're stuck with the chapters as we have them. We didn't make the chapters, but we use them because they're a convenient tool. So again, that last verse of the 4th chapter and now the beginning of the 5th chapter all seem to be in the same kind of vein. We said that the general idea that he's going to be discussing here is the concept of approaching holiness and being very careful when you do so. Because again, our tendency is, if a person gets a moment of inspiration, a burst of inspiration that pulls them towards service of God, it's very likely for a person to get a little too excited about it all at once, to jump in too quickly, and that can have negative effects. So that's one of the things that King Solomon is going to be warning us about over here and making us aware of, is that there has to be a certain level of hesitancy, not hesitancy in the fact that you shouldn't do it, but hesitancy in just how you should go about it. So we already saw where he basically handicapped the person running to the temple, right? He said that if you have a person who's going to the temple, quite literally, he said it's written as though it's in plural. He should watch his feet, but we actually read it as he should watch his foot, meaning even when you're watching your foot, even go in just with one foot at a time. I mean, the temple is a very holy place. You have to be careful. Besides the fact that you literally have to be careful of a lot of the decorum and the laws of respect for the temple, but also in yourself, you have to have a certain level of hesitancy is not really the right word that I'm going for, but you have to be careful. You have to think through what you do. In Hebrew, we would say that the person has to have a level of mitun, of slowness, to cool the jets, so to speak. Make sure that you're doing everything for the right purposes. And so he goes on at the beginning of the 5th chapter to discuss a couple of cases of people who are who should be careful about this. So let me jump into the share screen so we can all take a look at this together. For anybody who hasn't joined us in the past, this is what we do. We go through the verses together. I do not provide a translation on the screen so that we could go through a more what I consider to be a more correct translation. We're trying to get to the essence of the words over here. So what he said over here in verse 1 and 2 is that he said that a person should not jump, should not be chaotic with the way that they speak. Don't throw words out of your mouth, because when you go ahead and you talk to Hashem, when you talk to God, you're talking to somebody who's on a totally different plane of existence than you. So what you perceive to be as right and wrong and yes and no, and those things may be incorrect from the vantage point of God. So God is in heaven, you're on the ground, quite literally, and therefore you have to be careful. You should limit the words that you say. The way many of the commentaries understand this is they say a lot that this is talking about throwing complaints at God. The person should be very wary of complaining towards God because you really don't know what you're dealing with. I offered that there's really another kind of deeper understanding or different understanding, is that we're talking about prayer in general. When it comes to prayer, a person has to be very wary and careful with what they say. Of course, there's obligations of prayer, that's a different thing. but when a person's adding in their own supplications, be careful of what you say. God is on even let's say with praising God. I showed you a passage from the Talmud last time that said that even when enumerating the praises of God, we're limited. We only actually enumerate 4 specific praises of God. We don't go further than that because that's where we know we're safe. But once you start adding on more things, it gets a little more sketchy to praise God. And in that, he also mentioned that when you want to get a better sense of where you actually are, where are you as a person actually standing in your relationship to God, he offers that, or at least how I'm understanding is, he's offering that perhaps a person should look at what they say when their mouth is unguarded. And again, this is actually an idea that's echoed in the passages of the Talmud, that when a person's mouth is unguarded, whether they're angry or under the influence or anything like that, that's where you start to get a sense of what the person's really like, what really comes out of their mouth at that point. So in this vein, talking about ways of speech, but particularly ways of speech that we understand, we would typically on the face value perceive to be holy speech, he again gives us another couple warnings. That's what we're going to be seeing here in verse number 3. Okay, so again, this is chapter 5, verse number 3. I'm going to highlight it here so everyone can see it together. Okay, and we'll take this piece by piece. It says, Ka'asher tidor neder lelokim. When, Ka'asher means when, you vow a vow to God. That's some Hebrew syntax over there. We verbalize a noun very often, and then we speak out the noun also. So when a person swears an oath to God, al ta'acher l'shalamo, do not hesitate or do not wait to fulfill it. Ki ein chifetz b'kesilim, because it is not his desire for fools. God does not desire fools. Eit asher tidor shalem, rather, or it's the unspoken word here is rather, that which you swear, that oath that you take, you should fulfill. Okay, and honestly, I'm jumping back and forth between swear and oath just because in English they seem to work better. But a neder, this term over here, neder, is specifically a dedication. A person's dedicating themselves or their valuables or their possessions. A person's dedicating those things to God. The typical example is a person swears off of something that they know is bad for them. They say, whenever I get drunk, it's not conducive for my service of God. I'm swearing off of wine. The extreme example of that, of course, would be the Nazir, the person who completely swears off of wine and a number of other things, again, for the purpose of God. So what he says over here is, let me read it all together in the Hebrew, then we'll discuss it piece by piece. Kasher tidor neder lelokim, when you swear an oath, when you make an oath to God, al ta'acher l'shalamo, do not wait to fulfill it. Ki ein chifetz b'kesilim, because it is not his desire for fools. Eit asher tidor shalem, rather that which you swear you should fulfill. Okay, so there's a number of things to put in, to keep in mind over here. Is number one, this is again another case of something that if you were to ask me at face value, I would say an oath, to take an oath is inherently a holy act. That would be an understandably holy act, right? We find this by nearly every religion has some sort of version of an oath, where a person, an ascetic person, will go ahead and swear off of something, whether it's speech or an oath of silence, whether it's earthly possessions, whether it's, again, like we have our case of the Nazir. There's also every approach towards God, there's some sort of level of swearing off of things or swearing to do things. Another example, right? So to make a dedication, a monetary dedication, right? We have that all over there. A lot of times in Judaism, particularly, if a person gets an aliyah to the Torah, very often they will dedicate money in behalf of somebody, dedicate tzedakah, right? So what he says over here is, if a person takes that oath, who takes this clearly or seemingly holy act of taking an oath, that person should not wait to fulfill that oath. Get that done right away. I think there's something that he's saying over here that he doesn't speak out explicitly, but I think part of what he's saying over here is that we have to look at the oath itself. And when we look at an oath or a promise that a person makes, in reality, when a person takes an oath, they really have done nothing. They've said that they're going to do something, but until they've done that action or dedicated that object or whatever it is, they haven't actually done anything. So I think that's an interesting idea over here, is that an oath, while it is perceivably a holy action, an action that should itself bring you closer to God, it's not. It's a tool towards action. It pushes a person towards action. So in that sense, it's not something holy in and of itself. It's not really a conduit. It's something that pushes the person themselves towards action. So what's the actual coming close to God? What's the actual service of God that's done? That's the action that was sworn to be done, not the oath itself. So the oath itself is really a half a thing, and maybe perhaps nothing at all. It might just be. There's a halachic reality that's created with an oath. If a person does not fulfill an oath, there's bad repercussions, let's say. But at the same time, it's the action that's really what brings the person to greater connection to God. So in the same theme of things that look like a good idea at first glance, but really you have to think twice. So he's now bringing in this idea of an oath, and he's going to go actually in 3 levels. 2 here are in this verse over here, and the third one is going to be in the next verse, in verse number 4. So again, when a person does make an oath, does take an oath to God, that person should not wait, should not push off fulfilling that oath. Okay, ta'acher, that's the word acher meaning after. It's being put into a verb form. So you should not push off fulfilling that. Shalom, like shalom, means completeness or wholeness or peace, or in this case, really wholeness. So a person should not wait to fulfill that oath. And he explains why that is. He says, because God does not desire the fools. Again, our fools, that's our person who is so wrapped up in their worldview, in the things that go on in their head, that they have a hard time seeing through the fog to the outside world. That's what we've been understanding, the kasil, the fool. So God does not want the fool, not necessarily the fool himself, but God does not want the fool's action or speech, I would say. God wants his or that person's action, not just their neder. Okay, so that's first of all. The first thing is, if a person goes ahead and takes an oath, don't wait for it. Don't wait to do that action. Recognize in yourself that the action is the main thing. The oath is only a partial thing. So a person can walk away. If a person, let's say the example that I went with before, a person goes ahead and gets an aliyah on Shabbat, right? They get called to the Torah on Shabbat, and after their aliyah, they go ahead and they dedicate some gift to the synagogue. So has the person done anything yet? Not really. They still have to actually go and fulfill that obligation. That it can ride on a person for quite a while. We'll talk about that more later. So that's first of all. And he says, rather, what does God want? God wants you to fulfill your oath. Okay, and that's a kind of a second step. Is first of all, don't push off fulfilling it. Definitely fulfill it. So I would say there's almost like 2 grades over there. Don't push it off, and also don't forget about it entirely. And unfortunately, it's very easy if a person goes ahead and shoots their mouth off, right? That's kind of what we've been talking about until now. If a person goes and shoots their mouth off, they may end up with quite a few nidarim, quite a few vows or oaths that they've taken, and they can completely have forgotten about them. And that is not a good idea, as again, we're going to see in a couple verses. Is very, very, very bad, for lack of a more sophisticated term, for a person to go ahead and take many oaths and not fulfill them. Okay. And besides the fact that it's one of the 613 mitzvot, the person has one of the negative commandments is for a person should not forget to fulfill their oath. Actually, the way that the Torah puts it is a person should not make their words vain. If your words are just meaningless, so that is a negative commandment for a person to do that. I mean, that's something that the Torah does not want a person's word. Torah wants a person's words to be meaningful. Okay, so two things. Number one, don't push off fulfilling it, but also make sure to fulfill it. Two kind of different, but obviously very similar related ideas. The next grade of this is going to be mentioned here in verse number 4. So without any further ado, I'm going to move on to verse number 4. Let me highlight that for you. Oops. Sorry, give me 1 second here. I'm having some problem here. There we go. Okay. All right. Verse number 4. I'm sorry. I hope everyone can see that now. So this is now like the third step to this. And this is Tov, Asher lo tidor, Mishet tidor velo tishalem. Better or good is a person who does not take a vow than the person who vows and does not fulfill their vow. So now King Solomon gives us an insight into actually something better. And we've already seen this now. We have a number of verses throughout Kohelet that all begin with the word Tov. And this is, to recap from a while ago, we said that King Solomon has avoided, at the beginning of the book, he avoided telling us what's good and bad. He just said that there's good. He mentioned that there is good and bad. He did not really talk about what those are. So he's consistently been going ahead and giving us examples of what he perceives, again, in his wisdom, what he perceives as actual good. And this is another verse, like a number of verses we had in chapter 4. There's another verse where he's telling us good. Here's good. You want good? Here's another definition of good. Good is the one who does not bother making the oath. That's much better than taking an oath and not fulfilling the oath. Okay? So there's a number of things that he's bringing out over here. Again, based on what we said in the last verse, where the oath itself, the vow a person takes, is in essence nothing. It doesn't have any value to it. It's only a pathway towards doing action. So he said, I got a better idea for you. Just do the action. Don't take the oath. Don't use this tool. It's a tool. It's there. It has. There is a halachic mechanics of an oath, but much better is for a person to avoid avoid the thing entirely. And again, the reason is obvious. We're looking for action, not just words, right? The obvious example is a politician. Politicians are famous or infamous for their ability to say lots of words and never actually fulfill on their promises. So here we have what King Solomon is telling us. What's the much better option? Tov, goodness, is somebody who doesn't even take the oath. Much better to not take the oath. And okay, if a person doesn't take the oath and doesn't get to action, that's still better than a person who took the oath and doesn't come to action. So either way, you're much better off if you don't take the oath. Whether you do it or you don't do the action, at the end of the day, you're much better off avoiding using this tool. And again, in the discussion of approaching holiness, and a person is inspired, his soul's on fire, so to speak, to go and serve God. Well, so a person may be pushed by themselves, or perhaps by their culture surrounding them. A person may be pushed to go ahead and take a vow. Well, King Solomon says, what does wisdom say? A vow is not a good idea. I think there's another kind of idea behind that, in the fact that a vow, an oath that a person takes, is usually reflecting their mood at a specific moment in time. But moods change, people change, and their realities change. So because of that, it's not necessarily a safe bet for a person to go ahead and take a vow at one time based on their current feelings, not knowing whether that vow is going to last them for an extended period of time. So that's something for a person to be wary about. For that
I have
reason,
a question.
Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned that every once in a while, King Solomon will throw in a sentence that begins with Tov, and I'm wondering if we can review some of what we've seen in the past, and whether maybe those phrases, those sentences, those pasuks that start with Tov might be a useful summary of Kohelet in general.
Yes, I absolutely think so. In fact, the way we've kind of seen it has been that each Tov has corresponded to a kind of a specific subject. I would have to go back and look at it, but we had in the last chapter, we had the contrast of the idealist who totally steps out of any discussions because they just can't deal with it. So we had a Tov there that said that that's an inappropriate way to act, and there's an appropriate way to act. We had the discussion of the control freak that we talked about. There was another Tov there. So yeah, I would have to put it together, kind of go back and see if we could make a little review out of that. So maybe I could look for that in the coming week to kind of try and do that to recap with these Tovs. So yeah, thank you. That's a good idea. Yeah. So when it comes to a vow in Torah law, in halacha, it happens to be it's a very interesting idea because the Torah does give us an option. If a person does make a vow and then circumstances do change for some reason or another, they have achieved some level of disappointment. They're not able to keep their vow the same way that they wanted to. There is a way to go ahead and remove a vow. It's called Hatarat Nidarim. We actually do it as a communal act every Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We do it if anybody if you go to synagogue for Kol Nidrei, that's exactly what Kol Nidrei is. It's an nullification of vows from the past year and potentially for the coming year. So it's something that's actually pretty important. And as you see from the fact that it's put in such a auspicious time at the beginning of the Yom Kippur service. But it is fascinating that the Torah goes ahead and it does give you an out. But King Solomon says over here, much better is to avoid the thing entirely, to avoid the entire subject as a whole. The rabbis have a very interesting idea that they mention over here on this verse. The sages in the Talmud, they say that somebody who takes a vow is like somebody who builds a personal altar for themselves, and somebody who fulfills the vow is if he fulfills that vow, then that it's like they brought a sacrifice on that personal altar. Now, here's the thing with a personal altar: we don't actually allow them anymore. They're not allowed. You're not allowed to build an altar for yourself nowadays. Since the times of the temple is the only place that a person can build an altar, or where an altar could be built, actually. So it's interesting that the Talmud goes ahead and uses this terminology. It doesn't say it's like somebody who builds the altar in Jerusalem. It says it's somebody who builds a personal altar, which is actually an action that's not allowed. So in that sense, a lot of the commentaries try to figure out, why does the Talmud use this expression, which seems to be a negative thing? And a lot of them, we actually come out because the Talmud's telling you taking a vow in and of itself is actually a negative. It's a sum negative or a net negative because it's something that you are not. It's less effective than you realize. Yosef just asked, or the Blair's just asked on the chat, should we not take vows? Really, a person should avoid it, and that's really what the Talmud and King Solomon is trying to tell us. There is a place for it. I'm not going to be. I would say if you are fortunate enough to have a Torah authority, I would definitely run it by them before a person goes and takes a vow. There is in kind of a cultural sense, we've developed this habit of saying, if somebody says they're going to do something, we say that we're going to do a bli neder, without the power of a vow. We actually try to avoid taking vows, will commit to doing something, but just never quite with that extreme power of a vow. All right, so it is actually a pretty intense idea. And again, that's kind of what King Solomon's telling us. A pledge is perhaps a little different. It's different than a vow. In fact, when if a person gets a Misha Berach on Shabbat, they get a aliyah to the Torah, and they say a Misha Berach, and they pledge a donation to the community. It is always done. It's actually in the text that it's done without the power of a vow. It's a pledge. If you never do it, you're not actually going to be held responsible. Now, the synagogue might have their own rules that might hold you responsible, and you definitely should do it. In fact, okay, you know what? Let me read the next verse. I will come back to it because the next verse is gonna enlighten us a little bit more onto that. It's a bit of a longer verse, so we'll take it piece by piece. But this should help kind of clarify some things. Particularly, we're going to see that the rabbis are a little. They take this to be a pretty severe idea. So he says like this. Sorry. Al titain et picha lachati et besarecha. Do not give your mouth. Do not allow your mouth to cause sin to your flesh. V'al tomar lifnei hamalach. Do not speak before the angel. Ki shegagahi, that it was a mistake. Lama yiktzofa Elokim al kolecha. Why should God get angry at your voice? V'chibel et maseyadecha, and ruin your handiwork. Okay, so this is quite a few parts to this verse over here, but it flows pretty well. So let's see that one more time. Al titain et picha lachati et besarecha. Do not allow your mouth to cause sin to your flesh. V'al tomar lifnei hamalach. Do not speak. Do not say before the angel. That's going to be up for a question of exactly what angel we're referring to, or if an angel at all. But do not speak, do not tell the angel, ki shegagahi, that it was a mistake. Lama yiktzofa Elokim al kolecha. Why should God, or why should you make God angry at your voice? V'chibel et ma'aseyadecha, and to ruin your handiwork. Okay, so it's a pretty straightforward verse when taken piece by piece like that. And again, on this idea, a person wants to jump and use their mouth to dedicate, to create some sort of obligation. It says, don't allow your mouth, which, as we already saw, is something that can sometimes reveal the insides of you, not necessarily what you want to come out. So don't allow your mouth to cause sin to your flesh. And this already is a fascinating idea because it's the first time that I can recall, I think I'm right about that. It's the first time that we've seen King Solomon talk about our flesh. Usually when he wants to talk about the physical world, he talks about under the sun. That's usually his hint to the physical world. But over here is the first time that I recall them using this term, bisarecha, your basar, your flesh. So that itself is kind of a glaring question. Why is this the terminology he's using? That to cause sin to your flesh. And he says, do not be put into a position, do not put yourself into the precarious position of having to explain to somebody. He calls it the angel, whether it's an angel, whether it's the gabai, the person who collects the money, whether it's, it could be anything. A malach, it really means a messenger. We happen to use it more often for an angel as a messenger of God, but it can really mean any sort of messenger. So a person should not put himself in a position where they have to go and tell the messenger, whoever this representative is, that they made a mistake. Listen, I thought I was able to do it. I can't do it. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to fulfill my vow. Well, that's putting yourself in a precarious situation, because why should you go ahead and cause God to be angry at your voice? Now, he doesn't actually say cause God. He says, why should God be angry at your voice? But I think the idea is the same. Why? Because of a person's voice, because of the words that came out of their mouth, they've now put themselves in this position where they've dedicated something. They've created an obligation where there wasn't one. And now they give the opportunity for sin. Okay, now we don't really like to think of God as angry. It's actually very difficult for us to say that he is, but we're just going to use King Solomon's words over here. And that is, why should God get angry at your voice? Meaning there was nothing else there for God to be angry at. You're doing perfectly fine without the vow, without this seemingly righteous move, which is actually pretty dangerous. Without that, you'd been on perfectly good terms with God, so to speak. But because of this, you've now put yourself in a bad situation. And that leads to something a little more close to home, which is that that will cause a destruction. Chibel, chaval means just general negativity or some destruction or tearing down. So chibel at Maaseh Yadacha is going to tear down or destroy your handiwork, and so that's a terrible thing. This verse has to be kind of understood through the eyes of the sages, and they say a rather frightening idea over here, which is that for the sin of the taking a vow or dedicating, actually says for the sin of vowing to dedicate money in public but never actually fulfilling it, a person can lose the members of their family. Now, again, I'm very uncomfortable approaching any sort of divine retribution discussion because I don't feel I have any firm grasp on that entire concept. But we do have the sages over here saying that there's a direct correlation between how a person goes ahead and vows money to the poor and the life of their own family members, particularly their children. There are explanations of why that would be the divine retribution. Again, I don't want to get into that because I can't confidently say anything about that. But what we do see over here is that it's a big deal. It's a big deal for a person to go ahead and to vow to give money, or really any action, and then to go ahead and not do it.
Well, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
We're talking about vows that are expressed through our speech.
Mm-hmm.
But I can imagine that there are certain vows that you take, for example, in helping the poor in your community, that you would take through your actions. For example, you might be participating in an organization that helps the poor people in the community. And just by showing up to their meetings or by taking resources from them that you would use to further their cause, but then not really acting on that. It's like you're making a commitment, but you're not fulfilling it. It's not a spoken vow, but it kind of falls in that category. Can you comment on that? Is it all about Picha, or how does everything else fit in?
Yeah, so that definitely. So you're actually touching on a big halachic idea. If you were actually to go and if you take out a Rosh Hashanah Machzor, the prayer book from Rosh Hashanah, and you open it up to the front, to the beginning, and you find the process of Hatarat Nidarim, of nullifying vows, or literally opening vows. So if you were to look at that, you'll notice there's actually a long list of ways that a vow can actually come about. It can happen through a handshake. It can happen through making a habit of doing a good action, but eventually dropping it. That itself could be, to some degree, a level of a vow. From the Torah's perspective, really a vow, a true vow, only applies once it's spoken. That seems to be very clear from the verses at the end of Numbers. So a couple chapters before the end of Numbers, you'll find that's the laws of vows are enumerated over there. So that when the Torah talks about a vow, it talks specifically about speech. But you're right. There is also a lot of power to a person's actions, even if they don't take a formal vow. And we, as a formality, we go ahead and make sure to nullify even those before Rosh Hashanah. I'm focusing on speech now, or he's focusing on speech now. The way I'm understanding it is particularly because if the goal is action anyway, speech is just, all you've done is you've created a middleman between your inspiration to do action, your actual action. So I would say that's where it's really, all you've done is add an unnecessary step, and you put yourself in a position where you may have to answer again to this angel, to God who's angry. All you've done is put yourself in this precarious position. So that's not a good idea. But you're right, Jacob. You are absolutely correct that there is something to just committing through action also, and that's something to be wary about. Perhaps he'll talk about it. I don't know. That's good. That might come up in the coming verses. I'm curious to see where he's going to go. Yeah, we'll see as we go along if maybe he gets to that idea. So the last thing I want to bring from this verse over here is coming back to this idea of bisarecha, of your flesh. Why he uses this term of your flesh? I think he actually wants to bring us one step closer to the person themselves. So there's you as just kind of a character in the story, but then there's your flesh. That means I'm talking about you yourself, your actual, the life that you live, the physical life that a person lives. King Solomon points out over here that by putting yourself into this position of taking a vow, you've actually caused sin, literally. Lachati means to cause sin, but I actually saw a number of the commentaries understand lachati means to cause a loss, and to cause a loss from your flesh, meaning that a person actually can lower the quality of their life with these vows. And I mean, I've had this personally, where I've taken not a vow, because I try to avoid that entirely, as we've seen, but let's say I've pledged money to an organization, and then I forget about it, or don't have the money at the time to give it, and then time goes on and you forget about it. And that's exactly what he said over here, al ta'acher l'shalmo. That was in verse number 3. Don't push it off. The more a person pushes it off, the bigger of a weight it can be on a person's shoulders. So even by taking these pledges, okay, obviously a pledge is a different story, but by taking a vow, a person puts themselves in a situation where their actual life can, their quality of life can decrease from doing that. So I think that's one last kind of idea that he's bringing out from this idea, from this statement over here, that don't let your mouth, which can be unbridled sometimes. So don't let your mouth go ahead and cause a loss to your personal life. Don't put yourself in a situation where you have to explain to somebody that it was a mistake, whether that person is the collector, whether that person is a rabbi or a learned individual who's able to nullify your vow. Don't put yourself in a place where you have to admit to the mistake that you yourself created. And the last thing is, don't put yourself, or why put yourself in a position where you're creating an opportunity to anger God, which he never asked you for, right? We find this also, that the Talmud relates that there were a number of instances in human history where human sacrifice was committed, so to speak, or almost committed, like by Abraham with the almost slaughter of Isaac, by the binding of Isaac so the binding of Isaac. So that was one case where it almost happened, didn't happen that time. There's another couple cases. There was a king of Moab by the name of Misha, who, in an attempt to appease God, our God, by the way, not his own gods, but to an attempt to appease our God, sacrificed his firstborn son. And the Torah and the prophet tells us actually that this is something that I never asked for. God is speaking. I never asked for this. I never wanted this. This never occurred to me as something that human beings should be doing. And yet there's still people who have gone ahead and done it. And that's kind of, that's an extreme example of this, but something that our own human brains may perceive as just being something, oh, for sure God wants me to do this. And you create an obligation that's never there in the first place. So going back to verse 1, where he talks about where you're on the ground and God is in heaven. So your vantage point is much different than that of God's. So God gives us plenty of things to do. there's not really a necessity for you to go ahead and create more obligations. Now, charity itself is an obligation already. It is one of the 613 commandments that we have, the mitzvot. So let's put that aside. But why create an obligation for yourself if that does not exist? And then put yourself in a position where you have to either answer up for it or potentially create a reason for God to be angry, or just decrease your own quality of life. The Talmud also relates to us that Hillel, one of the great sage Hillel, what he would do, people would bring sacrifices all the time. What he personally would do is he would not dedicate the animal as a sacrifice until he was already on the Temple Mount, right? So usually a person would dedicate it at home, schlep it all the way to Jerusalem, bring it to the Temple Mount, and then bring it as a sacrifice. Hillel was smart. What he did was he brought the animal first, only dedicated as a sacrifice there, and then was able to fulfill it right away and not have to worry about it riding on his head for that entire time. That's all the time we have for today. I was hoping to do one more verse, but we'll have to wait until next week. Thank you all for joining us. Let me go back to the regular session here. Okay, there we are. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you back here next week. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
You're
so
welcome.
much, Rabbi. See you
Thank you,
soon.
Rabbi.
Thank
Alrighty.
you. That was a good class.
Maybe it could be a